Welcome back, everyone. Here we are in our fifth installment, our fifth module for our course. And I want to look at Waddell's fifth chapter, which focuses on justice. He describes it as reimagining the world, with the clear implication that our current world is one that is unjust, right? Obviously, in many ways, which he talks about in the chapter. And again, I don't want to repeat everything he talks about there because I think he does a good job of explaining this concept of justice in Catholic moral thinking, which is also, of course, one of the cardinal virtues, the virtue of justice. And again, one of the things I like about his approach is how he really grounds that virtue, grounds the principle of justice in the ultimate fundamental foundation of human dignity, right? And with the goal of promoting the true good, the true flourishing of everyone that we can, right? So justice is not sort of an arbitrary set of rules, right? Rather, it's a systematic way of thinking about how do we respect the dignity of other people, and how do we promote the true good of everyone in a way that allows everyone to flourish and kind of attain ultimate happiness. That's really what justice is about. And he goes through a couple different ways of thinking about justice. There's commutative justice, right? This sort of contractual justice where um, kind of two agents enter into an agreement, and then acting justly is to follow out the terms of the agreement, right? So that we agree to provide good or service A in exchange for payment B, right? And clearly, that's a pretty simple form of justice in many ways, although obviously there are some complex issues that arise. Um, but really, I think in terms of focusing on what are going to be the big questions, the challenges from this chapter, I think most of our challenges are going to be around that concept of distributive justice that he spends a lot of time talking about in the chapter, right? And that's really, it's distributive justice that is at the heart of that opening quotation he gives from Paul VI, um, which many people know. Many people today know Paul VI, especially in conservative Catholic circles, primarily on account of Humanae Vitae. But of course, he's also the author of Populorum Progressio, which is on the development of peoples, where he takes a very strong stance against the economic inequalities of the world in his day. And if you follow these kinds of issues at all, you're aware that the graphs that would indicate or attempt to depict disparities in terms of wealth and income are by no means better today than they were in his time, right? That in fact, that there seems to be ever increasing disparity in terms of the percentage of resources, wealth, income controlled by the very few versus what's possessed by the many. Right? So those distributive justice issues that he addresses so strongly in those opening quotations are certainly still with us today. So, um, if you're coming to this chapter for some people in that respect is not going to be as challenging, right? Because um, some folks with their political and economic predispositions are going to be inclined to focus on injustices in our economic and financial systems, and be open to conversations about how to change that. Whereas for others, this is going to be a very, very politically, philosophically charged issue. Um, but I think Waddell does a pretty good job of presenting the church's teaching pretty clearly. As I presented, at least in one of the threads in earlier discussions, if you go back through the church fathers, through a lot of Catholic tradition, there are some very strong statements about the importance of distributive justice and warning against the accumulation of wealth. And those are, I think, particularly challenging topics and ideas for American society, right? Because America, perhaps more than any other major uh, country in world history, has really been shaped by um, the capitalist ideal in many ways, right? That kind of what united all the different people that came to this continent to form this nation was not shared religion, it was not shared ethnic identity. What they all shared was sort of this capitalist approach to economic life. And that really became sort of the defining feature, right? Which uh, gets solidified and reinforced in many ways through our history. Perhaps most recently and powerfully in the Cold War, which was really a battle of economic systems in many ways, with capitalism emerging victorious, right? And so critiques of that system are going to hit pretty close to home for American Catholics. Um, and I think that is worth recognizing. It doesn't mean that we necessarily accept every statement by every pope or bishop's group uncritically in regards to critiques of the American economy. But I think we ought to recognize that given our context and our possible biases, that we might need to wrestle with this, say, more than some other issues, because we're coming from a culture, we're coming from a history that is going to predispose us towards a focus on individual merit and private property in a way that might be in tension with many of the trends in traditional Catholic teaching. And so again, I just encourage you to read carefully and think about his argument, and then we can discuss on the discussion board. There were just a couple things I wanted to add or kind of highlight in anticipation of that discussion, right? And one, again, is to go back to kind of basics, which, as I said, he really roots it well in human dignity. But I think this also goes back to something I raised in earlier videos, right? And our basic understanding of the nature of the human person. And that one of the challenges, again, we face given our particular cultural historical context is that 21st century Americans are remarkably individualistic, right? We tend to take the basic unit of human reality as the individual, right? And then we build up a set of relationships around that individual uh, to the point where, okay, well, now we have an individual into society and with these different relationships. But it's really the individual that we focus on and that we root everything in, right? And that um, is at least in tension with, if not contradicting, other ways of thinking about the human person, the human reality, right? And really, I think if you look at Scripture itself, there are some real challenges, right? That Catholics, for example, talk a lot about emphasizing the reality of the sacraments, right? That Jesus isn't just being figurative when he talks about this is my body and blood. And yet, how do we deal with those passages in St. Paul where he talks about us all being one body, right? That we are um, as united as the eye and the mouth are in our own bodies, right? That while we are distinct, we are also profoundly and deeply interconnected. And I think that is, again, a reality that we as Western modern Americans have a tendency to downplay. We see relationships as more accidental. Whereas in Christian tradition, at least in much of Christian tradition, there's a much stronger emphasis on the interconnection of people, right? That it's only really in community. It's only really as part of a city, of a nation, of humankind as a whole, that we really have our identity as human persons. And along with that, right, then are going to follow, obviously, there are benefits, right? Those relationships, that imaging of a loving God. There are also obligations, right? And that we are bound to other people in a profound way. And that it is not just contractual, right? It is not just dealt with by that commutative justice, right? That it's not just freely chosen contracts that we enter into. We are, in fact, by our nature, bound with other people, right? And there are vestiges of this in our thought, even in our legal system, right? That at least in some instances, right, if there's another person in mortal danger who you could help without real risk to yourself, it can be considered a crime to leave someone else in that situation, right? Because we have this sense that if you can help someone in desperate need without putting your own life in great danger, then you ought to do so, right? As a human being, we ought to have that empathy, that connection with another. This is also at the roots of a lot of conservative Catholic political action, right? Why is it important for us to work to eliminate abortion or euthanasia, right? It's um, how does it affect us if a person we're never going to meet um, is aborted before their birth or euthanized in a nursing home far away from us, right? That why do we have an interest in this? Well, we have an interest in it. We have even a right to share in these kinds of decisions because of the connections that bind us as people, as human beings, right? That what you do with another person does affect us all, again, in the ways the Bible talks about repeatedly. Um, one of the things I think that we don't reflect on, though, are what are the other obligations? What are the other aspects that follow from those kinds of connections? And it's actually in the work of a non-Christian, as far as I know, and at least non-Catholic philosopher, Michael Sandel, who's a famous philosopher at Harvard, and he talks about the same sort of precise issue, right? He talks about how if we have a meaningful connection with these other people in a way that allows us to shape their behavior, so that I can say to this person, no, you can't have an abortion, you cannot cause the intentional death of this other innocent person. Um, because doing so kind of harms us as a community, harms us as a whole, then don't I then also have a connection to that child, right? So that if he is born and needs medical care, that I ought to help provide that care if I have the ability to do so. If he needs food, ought I not to help provide that food if he needs it, right? And I think this again goes to this idea of distributive justice, right? That in a society, even once we have the technological ability, even within the world, um, since God has given the physical world to all of us, we have a obligation to, in fact, make sure that those goods are available to everyone to meet their basic needs. Um, and again, this is kind of, I think, pervasive through most of Catholic tradition, but it certainly becomes very controversial when we get to the specifics of how and what this might look like in our modern world. And again, one of the obviously provocative points you will come across in the chapter, if you haven't read it already, right, is that Waddell is going to say this does in fact lead to situations where we ought to redistribute wealth, resources from those people who have accumulated a great deal to those who don't have enough to meet their basic needs and to live in dignity. Um, and again, we can discuss that more later. That will certainly come up in subsequent courses where we focus on Catholic social justice kind of issues more consistently. But I do think it is a consequence that follows from a Catholic sense of justice, at least in some situations, right? And this ties back into last module where we talked about, um, whether or not someone has a moral right to something they possess legally, right? That just because someone legally possesses something doesn't mean they have a moral right to it. I mean, to pick a very obvious example, um, you can have a legal right to a person as a slave, that doesn't give you a moral right to them. Or perhaps less provocatively, more related, right? If somebody comes in and steals the land of another person and then passes it on to their child, um, and if the former owners, heirs, come back and try to reclaim that land, is it stealing, right? Are they stealing something that rightfully belongs to the other? It's far from clear that that is the case, right? And so one of the challenges of distributive justice is figuring out how do we balance competing claims to resources. But at the very least, we have an obligation as a society to make sure, if we're able to meet everyone's basic needs. Um, and again, I think one thing that comes up over and over in these discussions over the years, as Waddell points out in the chapter, right, that when uh, the wealthy give from their excess to the poor who aren't having their needs met, that isn't in fact an example of charity, right? Is in fact an act of justice, right? And so what often is raised in these discussions is, well, really what should happen is the rich should voluntarily give from their excess to help meet the needs of the poor. And that can in fact be a good thing. Um, but that is not really addressing the underlying problem, right? The problem is if the distribution of resources is already unjust, then the solution is not just a voluntary um, sharing of some of the excess resources with others. That's only mitigating part of the harm, right? What really has to happen for any true charity can happen is we need to establish a just distribution. Charity would be a sharing of resources beyond what justice requires, right? So if justice already requires a more equitable sharing of resources, then the donation from one's excess is not, in fact, charity. So again, obviously a lot to wrestle with there, but I think it's an important point to recognize and something that would certainly be worth talking about as we move ahead into uh, discussion here in our module. Um, so, at, for the moment, I will leave the discussion there with those key points for us to continue on with in our discussion. And I will follow that up with one more brief video for this module focusing on the issues around just war.